Thank you to everybody who has joined. We're just going to give everybody who RSVP'd a chance to sign on here, and we'll get started shortly. All right, so we are going to give anybody who is still trying to sign in an extra 30 seconds here before we start diving into our content. But I do want to just get started with a few house rules. You'll notice that your microphone and camera were turned off automatically when you joined, and we would appreciate it if they stayed that way. We want to encourage you guys to ask questions in the chat function. There's a private chat function, so you can send it directly to us or email your questions to news@CEMAsys.com. And then my final note is that this webinar is going to be recorded. So if you need to check it out for later playback, you can, and it'll be available to you later on. CEMAsys is very excited to be presenting today's webinar, Navigating Canada's Modern Slavery Act, Supply Chain Compliance. Myself, Joseph Corcoran, and my colleague, Virginia Parker, will split the presenting duties today. We've got about 30 minutes of content for you, followed up by 15 minutes of Q&A. And I want to, again, really encourage everybody to ask any questions they have in the chat. If they don't get answered while we're running through the webinar, we'll make sure to address those questions at the end during that Q&A session. I want to start today with a little background on CEMAsys. We've been in the sustainability space since 2007, so we have over 15 years of expertise. Our company started in Norway, and due to our steady growth, we were able to expand to North America. We now have an office in Boston, Massachusetts, where we serve our North American clients. And the recent explosion of focus on sustainability in the business world has really skyrocketed our success, and we've opened up several more offices across Europe. That's another story, I suppose. I want to get into and clarify why we have had this success. We are an end-to-end sustainability provider. We have all the products and services that any company would need to develop a mature sustainability program into their organization. Our clients are familiar with a wide range of our consultants are familiar with a wide range of best practice standards and frameworks. This includes the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Science-Based Targets Initiative, the TCFD. Maybe you're interested in reporting through the CDP or in alignment with the GRI. And of course, there's the more investor-focused Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. All of our expertise in these best practice frameworks is then used to build and develop our cloud-based data management modules. So whether you're looking for greenhouse gas emissions accounting, supply chain risk mapping, or supply chain engagement, which is very relevant to today's conversation, or any other ESG metrics that might be relevant for your impact or sustainability reporting, we've got you covered. And of course, we've also integrated regulatory compliance into our modules alongside those best practice frameworks to ensure that any reporting, any analysis, or legal obligations that you may have are going to be easy to do. Speaking of legal obligations, the legislation that we're gathered here today to discuss is the Act to Enact Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Act, and to amend the customs tariff. I am getting a notification that my video and audio is unstable. Virginia, I just want to check in with you and make sure that you can still hear me.
I can still hear you loud and clear, Joe.
All right, thanks, Virginia. Let's look at the agenda slide here, and you'll see we're referring to this act with a very long name as just the Act. It's also referred to as Canada's Modern Slavery Act, but for today's webinar, and for simplicity, we're going to stick to calling this the Act. We're going to start today by jumping in behind the Act, taking a peek at modern slavery and why this legislation is important. Then we're going to navigate the Act, talk about what it is, who it applies to, and what it requires. After that, we're going to discuss some of the global best practice frameworks for addressing this type of modern slavery. And then Virginia is going to take us through the Act in action. So how we can work towards and achieve compliance with the Act in a way that does more than just check a box, right? Because this is really an opportunity to seriously improve your business operations. On top of that, you're actually going to be able to have a positive impact on the world as well. And then finally, as I mentioned, we'll have that Q&A for about 15 minutes at the end. And I want to remind you guys for a third time, please throw your questions into that private chat and we'll make sure to address everything we can. If we don't get to all the questions today, we're going to be able to follow up with you via email. So I mentioned that you are going to be able to have a very large positive impact socially, right? And that is because modern slavery is still prevalent in today's world. Now, modern slavery is an umbrella term that refers to many sorts of slavery that are going on in the world today. Canada's Act is specifically targeting forced and child labor. So the world has become very interconnected, which is great for so many reasons, but it's also led to these long and complex supply chains that make it very difficult to track working conditions. And historically, we've seen that it's the most vulnerable groups who become trapped into forced and child labor. Due to the pandemic, global instability, and unsafe migration in recent years, the number of vulnerable people who have been trapped in these situations has continued to rise. Latest estimates suggest that 27.6 million people worldwide are trapped in forced labor. And it can be very easy to think of forced and child labor as something very other, right? It's happening somewhere else, somebody else that's bad is doing this. But Canada imports more than $43 billion worth of everyday products annually that may be produced by forced and child labor. So this is something that we can have an impact on. And as I mentioned, forced labor has been increasing since 2016. There are over 1,200 Canadian companies right now that are known to import goods at a high risk of forced or child labor. Right? And so the Act is Canada's answer to this specific type of modern slavery. Right? They want to help mitigate forced and child labor across the world. So let's look at some of the essentials of the Act, starting at what it is. This new legislation requires companies across Canada and certain government organizations to provide annual reports on the 31st of every year on how they're addressing forced and child labor risks in their supply chain. Again, that is every single year on May 31st, you need to be sending a report to the Minister of Public Safety. Your reports are going to need to cover all of your supply chain across your organizations and across all the goods that you have. And I want to highlight that this bill has already received royal assent. This is going to come into force on January 1st, 2024, meaning that your first report is due on May 31st, 2024. That's 7 months away from now, and this is something that you absolutely need to be focusing on today if you want to be prepared. This is a big question. Who does the Act apply to, right? You're wondering, does this Act apply to us? Are we going to need to take this into consideration? So there's two different requirements that may cause your company to need to comply with the Act. The first is if you're listed on the stock exchange in Canada. Pretty cut and dry. If you're there, the Act applies to you, and you'll need to submit this annual report. The second condition has three conditions within it, so it's a little bit more complex. But if you are doing business in Canada and meet two of the three following conditions, the Act will apply to you. Those conditions are 20 million or more in assets, 40 million or more in revenue, and 250 or more employees. So again, if you meet two of those three conditions in one of the two most recent fiscal years, you're going to need to report to the Act. This includes a lot of Canadian companies, right? And a reminder, you have only a little over 6 months to get all of this information gathered and get this report ready. But don't worry, because we know what the Act is asking for. The Act states that companies must cover risk at every step in the production of goods, and that goes beyond your first tier suppliers as far down your supply chain as feasible. They're going to be looking for policies and due diligence processes, as well as the structures, activities, and parts of your supply chain that these policies are enforced. They're going to look for business divisions and their specific risks of forced and child labor, as well as the steps you've taken to reduce those risks. Remediation is going to be very key to the Act. So a description of what you have done or what you have in place to remediate forced and child labor is going to be critical, as well as descriptions of prevention training. So within your own organization, as well as what you're doing with or you require from your suppliers, as far as training for the avoidance or mitigation of forced and child labor. Again, an efficacy process assessment is important so that you can show that your policies and procedures are going to have the desired outcome as it relates to forced and child labor risks. And then finally, additional remediation measures for lost income should also be described. And that's going to show that you're fully prepared for addressing these risks of forced and child labor or the existence of forced and child labor in your supply chain. And the key to the Act is creating transparency. As long as you're stating your risks and the actions that you've taken, you're going to be able to achieve compliance. This is not about punishing Canadian companies. It's about mitigating forced and child labor across the world. Now, I know just threw these 8 things up on the screen and it seems like a lot, but I want to help you understand why you need to be prioritizing this beyond just the positive social impacts you will have. So we're all aware of growing market pressures for companies to increase their ESG performance. But I also want to point out that there are some pretty serious consequences in the legislation for businesses that fail to comply with the Act. And before we get to those penalties, I want to clarify what constitutes an offense. So if a person or entity fails to meet annual reporting obligations, if they fail to give reasonable assistance to a designated official, or if they provide false or misleading statements about the risk or presence of forced or child labor in their supply chains, right? That is what constitutes an offense. Again, it is not about punishing Canadian companies that find forced and child labor in their supply chain. It is about creating transparency and mitigating this issue worldwide. That being said, any entity found guilty of an offense is liable of up to a fine of up to $250,000 per offense. Also, the individuals who are involved in the business's violation will bear responsibility, right? So it's not just a fine that goes to the top level of a business and gets signed off on and paid and it's gone. There are individuals who are going to be taking responsibility as well. And then a final important note here is that it includes a customs tariff amendment to allow the prohibition on the importation of goods produced by forced and child labor. And this can have massive impacts on your supply chain if it is not something that you are aware of, not something that you are taking steps to prepare for. So giving you quite a bit of background on the Act, but I want to also add some global context to this legislation. The Act is built on globally recognized best practices, such as the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct, as well as the United Nations guiding principles. In aligning the disclosure requirements with best practices ensures that Canada's economy is going to be following and holding up these ethical business practices and upholding human rights. And then on a more individual basis, if you're able to meet these disclosure requirements, you're going to be able to showcase your company's commitment to combating forced and child labor and contributing to a more healthy, a safer, and responsible world. So the UN guiding principles that I just mentioned are a set of standards aimed at preventing, addressing, and remedying human rights abuses. And these principles are built on 3 pillars. Protect. States are responsible for protecting human rights against abuse by third parties, including businesses. Respect. Businesses are expected to respect human rights and avoid infringing on the rights of individuals. And remedy. Both states and businesses must ensure victims have access to justice, remedy, and accountability mechanisms. Right? And you can see why Canada's Act would use these pillars to kind of set the standard for some of the disclosures that they're looking for. Additionally, we have the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct. These guidelines outline best practices for identifying, mitigating, tracking, and communicating the risk of forced and child labor across your supply chains, which are all essential principles for ethical and sustainable business practices. These guidelines also include recommendations for businesses to responsibly address not only their environmental, but also their social and ethical impacts. And this is all included in information that Canadian companies will be required to disclose related to forced and child labor in their supply chains. So now we're going to have Virginia give us some context into just how these principles and guidelines can be used to comply with the Act.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe, for that great explanation of the Act. So now we've established why the Act has come into force, what will be required from companies, who will need to comply, and some global context for this legislation. So now we're going to move on and talk about the practical steps and what you need to be doing right now in order to comply and avoid those penalties that Joe mentioned earlier. So as Joe just described, the OECD guidance for responsible business conduct is a framework that is designed to help companies identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address the impacts in their operations and supply chains on things like human rights, the environment, and other social factors. The guidance is often represented as a wheel, shown here, to emphasize the interconnectedness of its components and also to illustrate that this is an iterative process and should be revisited year on year. So here at CEMAsys, we use this as the foundation on how to comply for the Act, because we know that other modern slavery and transparency acts are also based on this due diligence framework. So acts such as the Norwegian Transparency Act, the German Transparency Act, CEMAsys has worked with clients utilizing the structure of this wheel to help them comply. So that's what our approach will be to comply to this Modern Slavery Act in Canada. So let's go through each one of these steps, and I'll explain sort of how CEMAsys bases our assistance and experience off of this wheel for the Act. And we're actually going to start here in the middle of this circle, number 1, embedding responsible business conduct into policies and management systems. So it's important to remember, thinking back to that slide that Joe explained, the reporting requirements with all of those icons. Here would be the step that you want to focus on, the policy and due diligence process for complying with the Act. So this step should be continuous throughout the compliance project, and this will basically include a review of your policies and your initiatives, etc. So CEMAsys helps our clients support them on different improvement areas, going through their policies and making those additions. Now, when you're going through your policies and initiatives, it's important to keep in mind some of these guiding questions. So one of the most important example of a question that you would want to ask in this step is, do you have a supplier code of conduct? And then in that supplier code of conduct, does it appropriately cover the topics that the Act covers as well? So now moving on to step 2 in the OECD and CEMAsys process is to identify and assess adverse impacts in operations, supply chains, and business relationships. So this is when you're going to want to map out your operations and value chain to try to understand where modern slavery risks lie. So again, thinking back to the reporting requirements for the Act, here would be the step that you want to understand or you want to be able to report on the structure and activities in your supply chain, as well as those business divisions containing risk. So this step really lays out the foundation of the first step in this risk assessment. So now for our clients, we will be utilizing our supply chain control module and our standard survey to assess these risks. I'm going to revisit this standard survey in a moment, but that is basically a supplier engagement tool that CEMAsys has created specifically for this legislation to help automate this process. And now our supply chain control module is great to have a system in place because it will help streamline the reporting routine so that, again, you don't have to do everything manually. Now, step number 2, this entire step will take some time, exploring your value chain, getting an understanding of the risks, especially reaching out to suppliers and getting those responses back. So any way that you can automate this, the better. And I just want to touch on a few key features of our supply chain control module. So first of all, you have the ability to enter in all of your suppliers into one system, and you can do a high-level review of a risk assessment by location, which I'll show you in a moment. You can also view survey responses from your suppliers in your dashboard to be able to get an understanding of how complete they are and a view of what their problem areas might be. There are also supplier scorecards, so you can evaluate your suppliers on a consistent methodology. You can collect relevant documents from your suppliers and store it all in one place as well. So now here on the left, you'll see a picture of the ESG risk map. This you can overlay multiple different ESG risk features. And this is a really great feature for a high-level review. It can really help with understanding which suppliers you might want to prioritize first to just get that good image in first. And then on the right, you see the dashboard from our supply chain control module. This is really great for project management, being able to keep track of the progress on the surveys, and collecting all of that quantitative and qualitative data in one year. So having a system in place that can collect all of this documentation is incredibly important for complying with the Act. That'll come up through the rest of the presentation because they're really interested in that year-on-year comparison. So now moving on to step 3 in the cycle is cease, prevent, and mitigate these adverse impacts. So I want to emphasize again that the Act is really relying on the transparency aspect to help motivate companies to engage with their suppliers and make those changes. However, and so it's an incredibly important part of the Act to make sure that you are taking steps to reduce slavery or modern slavery and those risks. So thinking back to those reporting requirements, the Act requires you to detail any prevention training that you might conduct internally or with your suppliers. This is where you could either set that up if you don't have it already, or look into how a prevention training could be improved in some way. So this is also a great step for educating your suppliers and engaging with them. It's important that they understand what actions they need to take as well in order to help you comply with the Act. So now, if you do come across an instance or a supplier with a high risk of forced or modern slavery, there are a couple of different risk responses you can take. So first, there's the continuation of the relationship through risk mitigation efforts. This is obviously the ideal scenario at first. We don't want to just cut off relations with a supplier if they have the possibility of risk. We want to engage with them and help educate them on how to take the appropriate steps to reduce those risks. However, sometimes if we want to really show that this is something that is important for our company, if your supplier doesn't seem as willing at first to help you comply with this Act, you might consider a temporary suspension of the relationship while pursuing risk mitigation. And this would just highlight your commitment to mitigating these things and complying with the Act. And then, of course, last case scenario, if you have a supplier that is unwilling to take any steps to mitigate these risks, it might be time to consider a disengagement with the business relationship with that supplier. So now moving on to step 4, it's also incredibly important for the Act is tracking the implementation and results. So again, thinking back to those reporting requirements, it asks you to disclose on an efficacy assessment or how you evaluate the effectiveness of the initiatives and policies. So this is, CEMAsys created specifically a standard survey for this legislation that includes all of the questions you would need to ask your supplier to gather all the data. So that step is already out of the way. And you can also set up the standard survey in the system to be sent out at a given interval. So say you want to send the survey out on November 1st of every year, so you have time to collect the data to comply for the May 31st deadline. And then that's one more thing that is automated and off your plate. And then the key to this step is to ask yourself, do these engagement and education measures actually have an impact? Now, I just wanted to show you guys a snapshot of what this standard survey looks like. There are 5 different categories. It sits at around 50 questions in total, some of those being basic company information. But the key here with the standard survey was to formulate questions that could illustrate the possibility of there being risk without, asking your supplier straight up, do you have forced or child labor? So a question that we included in here, for example, would be, do you track the age of all your employees, or do you have a management system in place to do that? Now, if a supplier were to respond, no, we don't track the age of our employees, that might be a bit of a red flag for you to want to investigate further and engage with your suppliers to understand maybe why they don't have that and help get that implementation going. So now the second to last step, step number 5 in the OECD wheel, is to communicate how impacts are addressed. So we know that the Act requires all reports to be publicly available, particularly on your website would be great, or you could include it in an ESG report as well. And then the reports also must be submitted to a public registry through the website of the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. So since the Act is relying on transparency as of right now to make changes within our organizations and supply chains, it's important to consider the public scrutiny risk that you could have by not complying with the Act and not addressing the modern slavery risks. So it's important to consider the risk of reputational harm if you're not making progress on your modern slavery risk over time, regulatory proceedings, civil litigation, etc. So again, as Joe mentioned before, and as we've been saying throughout the presentation, transparency is the key for the Act. So it's important to go ahead and start now and get ahead of understanding your supply chain and these risks before anybody else has a chance to find it and call you out on it. And then the last step in the framework, step number 6, provide for or cooperate in remediation when appropriate. So when a company identifies that it has caused or contributed to actual adverse impacts, they must address such impacts by providing for or cooperating in their remediation. So the Act requires a remediation plan should forced labor be identified. And CEMAsys guides our clients through responsible and ethical remediation, utilizing frameworks such as the Modern Slavery Response Remedy Framework, which was designed in collaboration with the Minderoo Foundation's Walk Free Initiative and the Human Rights Resources and Energy Collaborative. Now, we just covered a whole bunch of information. I just wanted to revisit the OECD wheel really quick. So we started off in the center, embedding responsible business conduct throughout our policies. This is something that you can be doing throughout the process, but it's a great place to start to understand where you're at in understanding your own modern slavery risks. The second one is to identify and assess adverse impacts. So utilizing some sort of system, engaging suppliers, prioritizing which suppliers might be the most at risk for these modern slavery risks. From here, you could either go on to step 6 if you find an actual impact of modern slavery and remediate that. And you can also continue on to step 3 with the cease, prevent, or mitigate. This really comes from engaging with our suppliers and making sure that they are up to speed on what they need to be doing as well. Step number 4, tracking the implementation of our new policies and initiatives for modern slavery. We want to know if the actions that you've taken have actually reduced the risk of modern slavery in your supply chain. And then number 5, communicate. We know that the reports must be publicly available and that you must remain transparent in all of your communication about the Act. So now as we wrap up this webinar, I just want to talk about a few key takeaways. So CEMAsys works globally with other transparency acts based on the OECD. And from our experience, the first year with new regulations like this is really understanding how to incorporate this new aspect into your reporting routine, into your risk management. So in this first year, we see clients utilize, especially consultant services, to help make sure that they are hitting all of those points. But CEMAsys' goal is to help build the capacity of our clients so that they can take control and mature into their own year-on-year tracking and report submission. So that concludes the presentation aspect of our webinar. We have a couple of questions here that we're excited to answer for you all. Feel free to drop any more questions in the chat while we answer these as well.
Yeah, so I've been reading these questions in the chat, and I actually have one here that I want to clarify just right off the bat. So the question is, if a company is international in Canada, do they also need to generate these reports? And that is dependent on the conditions that we discussed earlier, right? So if you have a place of business, if you do business, or if you have assets in Canada and meet 2 of the 3 following conditions, 20 million or more in assets, 40 million or more in revenue, or 250 more employees, then yes, you are going to have to comply with the Act. And I know this sounds pretty cut and dry off the bat, but it can be a little bit confusing. Maybe you have a lot of part-time employees, or maybe you have contract employees. You may also be wondering, is it revenue to Canadian clients, or is it revenue for sales made within Canada's borders? And sometimes this can take a little bit to determine. Our standard advice is to err on the side of caution, right? Start taking those steps right now to determine if your unique situation is going to fit the requirements of the Act. And this is absolutely something we can, work with you one-on-one to try to help you determine. And we actually had a similar question. There are subsidiaries of other companies in other countries that are already reporting to similar legal obligations, right? But if you meet those minimum boundaries for here in Canada, then yes, you are still going to need to respond to the Act, as well as whatever other transparency or modern slavery acts you are responding to currently. I will add that the Act does not specify if it is only that subsidiary that would need to meet the minimum thresholds, or the whole company. So that's still information that we are hoping to learn, but is not available yet. So definitely something we can stay in touch about going forward. Virginia, do you see any questions in here that you want to jump on?
Yeah, well, we're getting some really great questions in the chat right now. I'll start here at the bottom as well. There's a question here that says, since there are no guidelines on what the report might look like, what is a good place to start? And I would say from our experience in working with the Norwegian Transparency Act and the German Transparency Act, What we would do is we would set up a PDF report or a Word report, include all of the different reporting sections. So how Joe described that they are requiring your descriptions on your policies and due diligence process. So I would start there as its own section and just go in and describe to the best of your ability what those processes are. Right now, we can from our other transparency acts that we've submitted, they've been in forms of just, Word reports or PDF reports. So I would recommend starting by breaking up those reporting requirements and answering those individually.
That was a great response, Virginia. And we also had a question asking, what if a company doesn't have all of those or doesn't meet all those requirements internally? And I want to be careful answering this question. It's a little bit specific. So with other transparency and modern slavery acts, we have seen some built-in leeway in the first couple of years. Canada has made no indication of this sort of flexibility with the act that we're talking about today. So you're going to want to be getting everything ready to disclose as soon as possible. And if you don't have those essential pieces in place, then you're going to want to start building them. Now, that being said, right, it's possible that maybe you just can't get everything in place within the next 6-7 months here. So you want to be as transparent as you can about here's what we have, here's what we're currently working on, and here's our plan to then put these pieces in place so we can fully align with this disclosure going forward.
Awesome, Joe. We have another question here that's asking, how do we get our suppliers to respond? What if we send them a survey or request information from them and we just don't feel like we have the leverage with them that other companies might have? So from our experience, especially with our supply chain control module, we've seen that has a response rate of about 80%. So the way that system is set up in a way that makes engagement with suppliers easy. It makes it easy for them to submit the data so that there's not all of that back and forth. But really the key here, if you're not using a system, is that engagement. So being able to open that dialogue with your suppliers. Also, if you're showing commitment to them by helping them with education, with maybe upgrading some of their systems, it shows your commitment as well. Do you have anything to add to that, Joe?
No, I thought that was a very complete answer. I was scrolling through because we still do have questions coming in. So one thing I want to address is specifying the supplier tier level that's supposed to be assessed when filling out these reports for the Modern Slavery Act. And Virginia, I'm sure you'll be able to add to this, but they want as much information as they can get, right? And it's not always possible, especially in just 1 year, 6-7 months, to reach your entire supply chain. Suppliers of suppliers of suppliers. That's hard to do no matter what time constraint you have. But you need to do what is possible for you, and then explain your exclusions and explain any plans to expand your reach, right? Virginia, you have any thoughts there?
I would also just like to add to that prioritization will be a really big part of this aspect. So the Act doesn't define any sort of threshold, but it is important, especially when you're writing the report. Say most of your spend is at 2 or 3, and then you have maybe 10 other suppliers that doesn't have as much spend. You can detail that in the report, maintain transparent. Like, look, here's where the majority of our risks lie. So this is where we're going to focus our remediation prevention efforts. And that shows that you have commitment to compliance and reducing these risks.
That's excellent. I can see that a few people have asked for a link to the Act. That's something we can definitely share with you via email. We'll send you a follow-up email after the webinar, include a link to the Act and any other sort of relevant, maybe web pages that we think might be helpful. Virginia, any questions you want to address? I see some here about, supplier relationships or procedures. I can jump in on those, or unless you have something you want to hop on.
Go for it, Joe.
Yeah. Okay. So there is a question about changes to import and export procedures and costs. So procedurally, your import and export should not change very much, barring, a ban on certain goods, right? If there's a ban on certain goods being produced by forced and child labor, then yeah, that's going to change things quite a bit, and it's probably going to up your costs, doing some sort of workaround for other suppliers. Internally, you might run into some costs, right? So it's going to depend on what sort of due diligence and things you have in place right now. If you're already taking care of a lot of things that we've discussed today, you may not need to change very many internal procedures, and the process may be closer to you just gathering the information and then preparing that report. If you're kind of missing some of the key pieces of what we talked about today, it's going to be conducting that due diligence, creating that documentation, maybe doing some audits or verification processes. And of course, there are costs for implementing that sort of compliance. There's also costs for maintaining that sort of compliance. And it's very dependent company to company on what that cost is going to look like. It depends on your supply chain complexity. And again, that's something that we can help potential clients kind of figure out how much this might cost them, right? How much time it might take to build these things.
Great. So we have another quick question here that says, can the report be included in our annual report, or should it be a standalone report? So you will be submitting a standalone report to the online submission to the Department of Public Health, but then you can absolutely include this report in your annual report as long as it is publicly available. So as long as it's somewhere on your website and you include in your annual report everything that you also included in the report that you submitted, that would suffice.
Including this information in your annual report is actually a really great step to developing a report that includes some of your ESG, your sustainability or impact considerations. So if that's something that your company is considering doing, something that your company is looking at doing, you are going to be taking a really big step in that direction by gathering and reporting this information. And it's something that you can absolutely integrate into any of those other reports, like Virginia said. I want to address this question about supplier relationships, right? You're going to have international suppliers that maybe, find strain in having to come up with this information and share this with you. Maybe they find the request to be a little invasive, but I guess I don't want to make a total blanket statement here, but we've seen that sometimes the suppliers who push back the hardest on these sorts of legislations are really the suppliers who need them the most, right? You will be asking your suppliers for information that the companies should have, right? It's good governance practice, and it's how those companies can ensure they're running an ethical business. Other suppliers may try to use the act as a competitive advantage, right? So maybe now they're not only selling you their product, but they're also selling you, hey, we have all this information available, ready to go, and it's going to be easy for us to achieve compliance with this new act together. So it could really go either way.
Okay, great. We have another question here that asks about overlapping supply chains, or if those will get double counted. So I just want to clarify too that this is different than greenhouse gas reporting, where double counting would be extremely relevant. But here, the Canadian government really just wants to understand what their companies are doing in order to mitigate, prevent, and cease forced and child labor. So while they are collecting that data on how companies are doing, they're not necessarily looking for those concrete statistics, right? Because you and another company might share a supplier, If you both have to comply, then you both might end up reaching out to that supplier for that same data. However, it's not going to be double counted because this isn't a collection of modern slavery statistics itself, if that answers your question.
I see a pretty specific question about something that I said earlier. I just want to clear it up. It's asking about how regulations are built into the CEMAsys data management modules. So on one end, we have a specific module for the EU taxonomy, right? And maybe that's going to be, we're planning on expanding that to fit with more regulations worldwide. But what I really was trying to get at was that legislation follows what here we at CEMAsys consider, standard best practices, right? Things that we're very familiar with. So we're able to bake those best practices into the data so that when you're giving us your inputs and receiving your results, those results are in a form that is ready to be shared for these regulations, whatever they may be. And if there's a new regulation that doesn't necessarily fit with some of the data that we have on the output side, our modules are customizable enough that we can edit those outputs to match what you need for your reporting.
Thank you, Joe. It looks like we are just out of time. If we did not answer your question in this question section, we will respond to you via email, and we can also include a list of the other questions that were asked as well. So we had some great questions. I have to thank everybody for their engagement. I wish you all the best of luck on your compliance for the Act, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Bye.